I don't know what you called it. I've called it Imperialism, Revolution and Ultra Leftism. Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. I think this is a kind of follow-up to the last meeting that I did here, which is about a year ago, I think, which was generally on ultra-leftism and the characteristics of the ultra-left. And we talked very generally about some of the features and categories of ultra-leftism. This time we're going to look at the question of imperialism and how ultra-leftism understands or misunderstands imperialism. And the point I made, I think, at the first meeting, which I'll reiterate, is that by ultra-leftism we're talking about something much broader than simply the Trotskyist groups. There's something which we've become accustomed to, is the ultra-left is always somebody else. It's always outside the communist movement. But we also have to be aware of the dangers of sectarianism within our own party, within our own movement, and it doesn't always take simple Trotskyist features. So there's a good reason for kind of vaccinating ourselves, if you like, against ultra-leftism. And I know a number of comrades were at the last meeting, so I'm not going to run through all the characteristics that we talked about, but I think we were mentioning things like the importance of recognising that ultra-leftism is a historical phenomenon, that it's not something which is set in stone, that it changes, that it mutates, its characteristics may ultimately be quite similar, but quite often the guise that it appears in changes from place to place, and it changes from period to period. And we also saw that when Lenin was dealing with ultra-leftism in the early communist movement, he was quite keen to emphasise that ultra-leftism was a penalty that was being paid by the working class movement for the sins of right opportunism, right-wing reformism. And again, when we look at ultra-leftism, we should always, I think, remember that the main enemy within the labour movement is always on the right. It's right-wing opportunism and reformism that is the principal enemy, because that is the reflection of capitalist and pro-capitalist ideas within the labour movement. We also mentioned that to an extent ultra-leftism or left opportunism was a kind of mirror image of right opportunism. So just as the reformists would overemphasise the importance of parliament and parliamentary democracy, parliamentary struggle, electoralism, there was a danger that sometimes the ultra-left completely dismiss forms of parliamentary struggle or electoral involvement. And just as the right opportunists might emphasise class collaboration within the trade union movement, there was sometimes a danger of a leftist overreaction to that, focusing only on the class struggle within the workplace, kind of syndicalism or anarcho-syndicalism which existed in Lenin's time, and which was quite influential, especially in the early days of the communist movement. Now, one definition you could say of right opportunism is that it prefers to make short-term gains by sacrificing the long-term principles, the long-term strategic aims of the movement. And you could say, on the other hand, that left opportunism prefers, in a sense, to preserve the abstract principles of the movement rather than make short-term compromises. It's unable to make short-term compromises. So ultra-leftism is really something which is thrown up by the complexities of the class struggle itself. And because the class struggle is always more complex, ultra-leftism has this dogmatic strain. It tends to favour cut and dried formulas rather than to analyse situations afresh and to look at new features, new phenomenon. I think that's clearly one aspect of it. Now we want to look at the ultra-leftism as far as imperialism is concerned. So in order to do that, if we take Lenin's definition of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, I think we actually need to start by asking questions about the relationship between capitalism and revolution, between the characteristics of what are the characteristics of a bourgeois revolution. I'd say there are probably three elements of bourgeois revolutions classically, if we think from the 1600s to the 1800s, when the revolution swept across most of Western Europe. There are political or democratic aspects to bourgeois revolutions. the struggle against absolute monarchy, against feudal political structures, things like the English Civil War, the French Revolution, were revolutions principally about those political aspects. Then there's national elements to bourgeois revolutions, such as the American War of Independence, where there was a struggle of this new emerging nation against the domination of the British Empire. And many of the revolutions of the 1840s, 1848 in particular, had national elements to them. There were revolutions against the empires of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. So there were attempts by the bourgeoisie to take up the struggle to form national states. Some people refer to the bourgeois revolutions as bourgeois democratic. I think there's a debate that we could have there about how democratic they actually were. The American Revolution, for example, produced some of the great thinkers of bourgeois democracy, people like Jefferson and so on, the great documents referring to the equality of man. Yet American society that emerged out of the revolution was deeply unequal. It was based very largely on slavery, on racism. Jefferson himself was a dreadful racist in his attitudes, despite the fact that he was one of the most enlightened individuals of his day. So the bourgeois revolutions of that time all had tremendous limitations, but principally they're called bourgeois democratic because they were advances on the political structure. They broadened the political bases of the states of the time. So they can be described as bourgeois democratic in that sense. So that's bourgeois revolutions, but what about imperialism? Well, Lenin, in his analysis of imperialism, said that one of the principal features of imperialism compared to previous forms of international trade that capitalist countries had undergone was the export of capital. And the export of capital was something quite different from simply trading in commodities, buying goods in one country and reselling them somewhere else. The export of capital came about because in a number of advanced capitalist countries, the profits had accumulated to such an extent that it was difficult to find areas to reinvest them. And so investing them overseas became an incredibly lucrative way of dealing with this surplus. I was doing a bus tour a couple of days ago, one of the city sightseeing tours, and one of the facts that came up was that in the year 1900, half of all the railway engines in the world were built in Glasgow. All the locomotive engines were built in Glasgow. That's 50%, and that's not including the ones that would have been built in other places like Birmingham or London. So that gives an idea of how important Glasgow had been and how its connections in terms of exports overseas were. The railway system was one of the prime ways in which Britain expanded overseas. It was a way of controlling colonial territories, but it was also a way of using that surplus profits and investing in other countries. So, for example, most of the railways in Latin America, for example, were built with British money and British expertise. So this export of capital into developing, or what were then developing countries, had a number of effects on the local population. Well, first of all, of course, it would create a working class if one didn't exist already. If you build railways, you need railway workers to look after them. It also has an effect on the local capitalists, if any existed. In terms of how local capitalists in a country like India, or let's take China as an example, the way in which they reacted to this emergence of foreign capital was usually in one of two ways. One was to act as a middleman on behalf of foreign capital. They became buyers on behalf of big corporations and groups like the East Indies Company and so on. These people were usually called the comprador bourgeoisie. Comprador is a Portuguese word and it just means someone that buys something. And compradors were those that were the middlemen in between the foreign companies and the local markets. And these people obviously had a stake in imperialism because their fortunes were built largely on being involved in this trade. But another section of the capitalist class clearly was at a disadvantage in dealing with foreign capital in all sorts of ways, both on an economic level and quite often on a political level, because local natives would not be allowed to trade in certain areas. They would be limited in what they could do in terms of their political rights. And so there was a creation of what Marxists refer to as a national bourgeoisie, a capitalist class, but one which had an interest in resisting or had some material basis for conflict with foreign capital, with imperialism. And another factor of imperialist exploitation was that very often the imperialist powers, and especially Britain, would make deals with the local pre-capitalist classes, the feudal classes, the sheikhs, the maharajas, the sultans, and they incorporated them into the colonial structures. They sent their sons to Eton and to Oxbridge and to Sandhurst quite often. And this was a very important way of maintaining colonial rule, especially in the British Empire, where manpower simply couldn't have kept India, for example, couldn't have kept India down on its own. It relied to a very large extent on a class of collaborating feudalists. And because their interests were obviously not in terms of developing capitalism, you often find a very skewed, very uneven development of capitalism within the colonial countries. Quite often you find capitalism being very developed around the coastal areas, around the periphery of countries, but when you move inside, when you move inland, very, very undeveloped. If you think of the great cities of the empire in Asia, for example, you think of places like maybe Bombay or Calcutta, Hong Kong, Singapore, Penang, all of which are basically port cities. There were means by which goods and capital could flow in and out. Now, this kind of development then left revolutionaries in these countries oppressed by imperialism facing pretty much the same kind of tasks as the bourgeois revolutionaries of the 16 and 1700s in Europe. They had no democracy, so the question of democratic revolution, political revolution was still essential. They didn't run their own countries, so the need to break away from colonial rule and from imperial rule was still there, so the national element was still there. And because the capitalism that they had was a very skewed capitalism, very often their countries were still dominated by feudal relations in agriculture, so very, very backward countryside compared to perhaps very, very advanced cities. So this led many Marxists, including Lenin, to describe the tasks of revolutionaries in the imperialist countries as facing the tasks of the bourgeois revolution, because the tasks were essentially the same. But at the same time, the Communist International developed ideas based essentially on the experience of the Bolshevik Party, which was that these bourgeois revolutions didn't have to be owned by the bourgeoisie. That just as in Russia the bourgeoisie had proved itself unable to completely rid itself of feudalism, it couldn't develop the economy in a progressive way, and Lenin had developed the idea of an alliance between the workers and peasants. The Communist International also developed the idea that in certain cases the workers and peasants allied together could be the ones to fight for national freedom, for national liberation. They could be the ones that had the interest in uprooting feudalism. And the constant debate therefore among the early communist parties, and to this day, is to what extent the communists should go beyond that worker-peasant alliance into bringing into play other classes such as the national bourgeoisie. And this is an area of considerable controversy, and especially when it comes to the ultra-left. There tends to be a straightforward, simplistic approach, which is that no alliance with the national bourgeoisie is acceptable ever, any time, at any place. That's not to say that the communist parties always got it right. Sometimes they made compromises that proved to be unprincipled. Sometimes they were simply outmanoeuvred or outnumbered. But generally speaking, this is one of the big divisions, the question of how you approach the class alliances in countries dominated by imperialism. Lenin's analysis wasn't simply a political, an economic analysis of imperialism, it was also a political one, because he understood how imperialism, by generating huge profits, also allowed the bourgeoisie to buy off certain sections of the working class within their home countries. the creation of something he called the labour aristocracy. In other words, a section of the working class which could be won to support pro-imperialist policies, to argue essentially on behalf of the civilising mission of imperialism. And if you look at the 1900s, you'll find plenty of socialists in France or Germany and other countries, and even in Britain, arguing about the importance of the imperial mission, because it was creating capitalism, it was creating a working class, it was civilising these savage countries, and was therefore a positive thing. If you think today, these arguments still exist. If we look at Iraq, it's all about the modernising, bringing democracy to other countries, fighting fundamentalism. The arguments are slightly different, but essentially it's the same idea that imperialism has a civilising mission. It's a modernising tendency, and therefore it's something which should be supported by people on the left. So Lenin described these ideas broadly as social chauvinism, socialism in words, but actually very chauvinistic, xenophobic, ultimately quite racist in their approach to people in developing countries. But he also said that there was a leftist version of this, one which he called, I think we talked about it last time, Imperialist Economism, which is doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. By economism, he meant the tendency that existed within the working class movement to concentrate solely on economic issues. Traditionally, that would be the trade union issues of wages, conditions, and so on. But in the imperialist era, Lenin said what had happened was that some sections of the left, and he had the argument within the Bolshevik party itself, there were those who tended to shy away from the demands for national liberation and self-determination for colonies. They said these things were unimportant because imperialism had developed to such an extent that now capitalism existed across the globe. It was worker against boss, and that was really the only kind of alliance that was possible or necessary. And he found this to be a tendency that had to be combated because it failed to take up what he felt was one key issue within the struggle against imperialism, which was the struggle for democracy. And he said that the great contradiction existed between imperialism on the one hand and democratic struggle, political democracy on the other. That imperialism as a stage of capitalism was actually becoming less democratic than it had been in 50 or 100 years before in its pre-imperialist stage. That imperialism generated very reactionary tendencies, and that this was an opportunity, in fact, for revolutionaries to take up democratic struggles because they would necessarily have an anti-imperialist element to them. Take one quotation here. In arguing against these imperialist economists, Lenin said, "Democracy does not abolish class oppression. It only makes the class struggle more direct, wider, more open and pronounced. And that's what we need." So in other words, he saw the link between consistent struggle for democratic rights and democratic issues as a way of uncovering broader struggles against capitalism and imperialism. So that's essentially Lenin's view. Export of capital, very uneven development of the world economy, uneven development within the territories themselves that are oppressed by imperialism. Let's look at what Trotsky said as a kind of counterweight to that. Trotsky said, "Marxism takes its starting point from the world economy, not as a sum of national parts, but as a mighty and independent reality which has been created by the international division of labour in the world market, and which in our epoch imperiously dominates the national markets." Now, that's quite different, I think, from the definition given by Lenin. And in another piece, which I think we mentioned last time, the transitional programme, Trotsky said, the economic prerequisite for the proletarian revolution has already in general achieved the highest point of fruition that can be reached under capitalism. Mankind's productive forces stagnate. Already new inventions and improvements fail to raise the level of material wealth. These two ideas, I think, are quite closely related. And, of course, they're fundamentally wrong. He wrote that in the last quote there is from 1938, and it's quite obvious that material wealth has increased dramatically, if unevenly, throughout the world since that time. He had come to the conclusion that capitalism had simply reached, it got too big, and got too big for its boots, and it couldn't go out and buy another pair of boots. It's that simple. That was it. Capitalism was finished by 1938. But he's also saying that the world economy exists as a completely independent reality, and this goes against very much goes against Lenin's idea that imperialism was an example of uneven development, an uneven process. One, because capitalism itself develops very unevenly because of the search for profit. It's not a rational, logical system. And secondly, because imperialism had really divided the world into two, into those countries which were imperialist and which were oppressor nations, and those which were oppressed. And this was a fundamental element, I think, of Lenin's understanding of why it was wrong to speak about the world economy in general, or wrong to speak about capitalism in general, without understanding these different mechanisms at work. I think there's a fundamentally different relationship, understanding there of a relationship between the national economies and the world economies. And I think you can see yourselves, I think, that the arguments there from Trotsky are kind of similar to some of the arguments you hear from liberal theorists and neoliberal theorists about globalization, about how if only there was more trade, not less, then that would somehow help the development in countries like Africa or Latin America or parts of Asia. More globalization, not less, would lead to this kind of change. Trotsky's argument's a little bit different because he didn't believe it was possible that there could be any further development, and he was obviously completely wrong in saying that. But nonetheless, his argument here is fundamentally at variance with Lenin's. Lenin's was a much more elastic concept. It was much more dynamic. He saw the conflicts within imperialism, I think, in a much better way. Trotsky's, I think, was simply far too static, and also he tended to lump together very different levels of development into one. One area where he did that was in a theory, if you can call it a theory, an insight he had. He talked about how imperialism combined an uneven development. This is a phrase that's constantly used, combined an uneven development. What he meant by that, in a sense, is quite simple and is quite obvious, which is that as imperialism brought all the benefits of technology and economic growth into these backward countries, there was a tremendous gap between the most backward elements of the society and these new elements coming in from overseas. I'll give an example of that. Last year I was in the city of Hyderabad in India, which is now being turned into this huge information technology centre, and I was passing through an area which they were clearing for the building of a new Microsoft research and development building. And because the terrain is very rocky, they obviously had to clear a lot of the stones before they could start the building work. And on this building site, there was not one single mechanical digger, not one single JCB or anything approaching it. It was all being done by hand. There were hundreds of men with sledgehammers and pickaxes and what have you. There were hundreds of women with baskets on their head carrying the stones. And what they were doing was laying the foundations, of course, for what will be ultimately one of the most advanced information technology centres anywhere in the world. Now, that would be an example of combined and uneven development, this kind of classic contradiction between the most advanced level of production possible and this very, very basic element. But of course, what's important about this is that Trotsky then assumed that the most important element was the most advanced. He assumed that because these countries were receiving the benefits, inverted commas, the benefits of high-scale technology and so on, that somehow raised society up to that highest level, rather than saying that, in fact, it wasn't quite that simple. Because when I asked locally about the building sites, one of the interesting things is not that this was simply the working class being exploited on a very kind of simple scale, but the fact that all the building workers, male and female, belong to a particular caste within Indian society. certain castes were not allowed to do that kind of very basic manual labour. So what you had isn't simply a replication, it's not simply a duplicate of the kind of struggles that you might have on a building site in a country like Britain, where you might put it quite simply as being workers against bosses. What you have is actually a much more complex set of factors, which include, the accumulated cultural inheritance of generations upon generations, and it's not as simple as making a leap to say, well, this is simply a conflict between labour and capital. There's actually pre-capitalist elements there. There's elements of ideology and so on. There's a classic quote from Marx, talking about something quite different. He said that the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living. It's a very graphic phrase, but by that he was simply pointing out that we can't, no matter how much we can develop the productive forces, we can't immediately go beyond the bounds of all the inherited social relationships and cultural relationships and ideologies that we all grow up with in society. And all these elements have to be taken into consideration too. And I think one of the characteristics of ultra-leftism is its failure to understand that. There seems to be always a very mechanical relationship between economic realities and political realities. I think Lenin had a much more organic view of it. I think he saw the development of politics as something which involved not just dry economic relationships between people, but also issues of culture, which could be racial, could be ethnic, national, gender. All of these things have an important impact on relationships between people and have an effect, therefore, on the class struggle. But I just wanted to end this section, at least, on just a couple of quotes which are a bit more up to date than Trotsky in 1940. This is Chris Bambury from the SWP. He says, in a world dominated today by the division between worker and boss, Trotsky's notion that only the working class stands for change, that only the working class can change society, retains its full force. Now there's two problems with Bambury's assertion. The first is that it's certainly true that the working class is the main, most consistent fighter for social change, but it's completely wrong to suggest that it's the only force. It's wrong to suggest that an ally is only an ally because they're an ally to the end. There can be temporary allies. You can find alliances with many social forces which are not based on agreement on the ultimate goals but are tactical or based on a temporary agreement. And very interestingly, because it was from his own party, one other member of the SWP, Chris Harman, wrote a very interesting article on the size of the working class in the modern world. It was very well researched, I think. But in the end, he comes to the conclusion that the working class, as he describes it, accounts for 45% of the world's population, which is a percentage that has been constantly increasing, obviously, for many, many years. But he comes to the conclusion in the end that the working class is still, on a global scale, a minority class. And what he doesn't answer is the question of how it links up with the majority, the other 55% of social classes, which he describes as essentially peasants, small commodity producers and so on. There's no connection there between his analysis, which I think is actually very good in terms of showing that the working class is still alive, that it's growing, it's a vibrant social class, but there's no connection between the political programme of how the working class then makes an alliance with the peasantry, whether it should make an alliance with the bourgeoisie at any point. There's no connection there at all. Another quote, and I'm sorry they're all coming from the SWP, but they were just easier to get off the internet than anything else. This is a guy called Charlie Hoare writing actually about China, and he's talking about the failures of the post-Mao economic reforms, which obviously it's out of date in itself, but he said, the roots of that failure lie not in mistakes or inadequacies of the Chinese ruling class, but in the nature of capitalism as a world system of production, in which the nation-state has become a brake on real economic development. Now again, the mistake that's made here is to suggest that it's the nation-state that somehow is a brake on economic development, rather than the social structure of capitalism. That's the basic Marxist analysis. It's a class structure of capitalist society that is itself a barrier to the future development of the economy. He's also completely wrong, of course, because again, he wrote this in 1990. In the time that he's written that, the Chinese nation state has managed to double, well, up more than triple its size as an economy. So again, the same ideas are still around that were around 50, 60 years before. The idea that capitalism's finished as an economic system, the idea that the nation state is finished, that it's become a barrier, that we should get rid of it. That's the way forward. These are very similar problems, very similar solutions being put forward by various groups of the ultra left, but they're all entirely mistaken, and we should really aim to counteract this kind of misinformation, misdirection, and misstrategy. So I'll stop there.